It's the week ending Saturday the 5th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped Live. In the past 7 days, we've seen Meghan Markle launching legal action against the Mail on Sunday, Storm Lorenzo hitting the UK and Ireland, and as impeachment proceedings develop at pace, Donald Trump tweeting a Nickelback video. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining us today from the week's digital team is Kari Wilkin. From Money Week, the economics writer with the voice of gold, it's John Stepek. And from LBC's For the Many podcast, special guest Iain Dale. Now, Iain, you are constantly on my TV screen. I'll sometimes.
Sorry about that.
Well, I do subscribe to the Iain Dale channel, just under the God channel.
Oh, there's an idea.
But no, seriously, I sometimes go to bed watching Newsnight, wake up and put on Good Morning Britain, and you're on both. Do you ever sleep?
I don't need an awful lot of sleep, it has to be said. I did ask Newsnight once why they invited me on so often, and they said, well, we think of you as the thinking man's Brexiteer. But you'll be the judge of that over the course of the next hour.
Very well queued up. Yes, well, you may have noticed that we do have a live audience. One more cheer, please, everybody. And that is because this episode is being recorded live at Podcast Live Politics, which is basically like Reading Festival for nerds. Actually, who am I kidding? It's like Cheltenham Festival for nerds. And to celebrate the fact that we are doing something a bit different this week, we are doing something a bit different with the format as well. We are looking at underreported stories as usual, but there is some fairly large news over the last 2.5 years we've studiously avoided. It begins with a B. And yes, you may have heard of Brexit, but are there underreported sides of it? That is our mission for this live edition of The Week Unwrapped. And starting the show this week is Kari. What have you got for us?
Forget Brexit. What about Nexit, Itexit and Frexit?
The European Union really does not want one of the children to leave the house. They do not want that. They are afraid that if they would allow it, that maybe another country would follow. Maybe Italy, Holland, France, whatever country would think that, well, it might not be such a bad idea. Mr. Trump saying that we will have a lot of trade agreements and maybe it was too sweet. So I believe that also from the European part, I'm sure the British made a mess. I'm very clear about it. But also from the European part, there was no incentive to get a good deal. They wanted to make an example to any country in Europe that if you try to do this, it will be a mess. So a big disincentive to leave the European Union.
Geert Wilders, leader of the Dutch Party for Freedom, speaking to CNBC last month. Kari, what's the story here?
So he's basically saying that, the EU is victimising essentially Britain and giving us a terrible deal to scare off all the other 27 member states of the EU to try to stop them pushing for an exit. But he argues that nevertheless there's still a very strong appetite among all of these remaining, well, not some of these remaining members, and that they may also be following us out of the door very shortly. Now, that view was echoed by Jacob Rees-Mogg last week at the Tory conference when he was asked, do you think this is the beginning of the end for the EU? And he said, yeah, I don't see it surviving. Whereas, interestingly, Michael Gove, who was there beside him, did a U-turn on his statement during the 2016 referendum when, in his words, Brexit would herald the democratic liberation of a whole continent. Whereas last week he actually said, no, I think they're going to stay. But I do think the EU is going to evolve and be very different in the next decade or 20 years. It may not be recognisable, but it will stay. There's a lot of debate, really, about whether Brexit has harmed the EU or whether actually it could boost it.
Yeah, so I've got some results here from a recent survey conducted across 10 European countries by the Pew Research Centre. And basically, a median of 74% of those polled say that the EU promotes peace. Most think it promotes democratic values and prosperity. Admittedly, 62% did say it doesn't understand the needs of its citizens. But are these not generally positive results if you're someone who thinks that it would be a bad thing for the EU to fall apart? Doesn't it actually seem that, despite what Geert Wilders is saying, there isn't a queue of countries waiting to leave?
I think that's absolutely fair to say. I mean, Britain has always been arguably the most Eurosceptic country in the EU. And from the point of view of someone who personally voted leave, I don't particularly feel very strongly about how the other EU countries feel. If they want to go ahead with further integration, then in a way I think that it's sensible for Britain to get out of the way of that, because we do tend to stand in the way of further integration more than any other member state. So if we clear off, they can go on with doing their thing, we can do our thing, we can all be pals, we can all be happy.
Yeah, but hold on, John. It's fine to say if they want to get on with further integration, they can do that without Britain as part of it. But what if they want to follow us, as Kari is suggesting, and they all want to exit? That's not such an easy thing to just sort of wipe your hands off, is it, if we've triggered the whole process?
But I suppose what we've just been saying is that Britain, the idea of Britain leaving and the kind of the kerfuffle that we've got ourselves into, as Geert actually says, is, pour encourager les autres.
You're on first name terms with him.
Yes, it's good pals, got the same hairdresser. But yeah, so I think that what Kari's saying is true. I think probably it has lessened the appetite to leave. At the same time, if you look at France, there's riots probably down the Champs-Élysées right now. The Gilets jaunes haven't gone anywhere, so...
I think it is very hard to disentangle how much of an effect Brexit's had, because, to state the obvious, all of these countries have got their own political systems, their own political agendas. So to attribute, if there's a lessening of appetite for leaving the EU, it's because of Brexit. And I do think no one on any side of the argument can argue that Brexit's going well. But so, clearly it is going to be...
Mainly because it hasn't happened.
Well, exactly, that's the point. It's not going well, is it? The negotiations are just going on and on and on.
I mean, on that point, Ian, do you think, even if you're an absolute ardent Exeter and you're French or Greek or Italian or whatever, you could honestly make a case that Britain has shown this is a great procedure to trigger? This is obviously going to work out brilliantly. It does make it harder, doesn't it, the shambles that's happening?
Well, I think it reinforces the view that the political elites aren't listening to the people. The referendum happened 3.5 years ago now, and it still hasn't happened. If it had happened, people could judge whether it was a success or a failure. You can't judge it on the basis of the fact that we haven't left yet. Now, I don't know whether it's going to be a success. I believe it'll be a success, but I can't say I know, because how can you predict the future?
But just the difficulty of leaving. And, we're not in the Eurozone. Imagine, if you think Brexit's bad, what would it be like if your whole currency is tied up in this? It's not just about would it be good or bad not to be in the EU. It's just how the hell do you get out?
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? It's Hotel California. You can vote to leave, but you can never actually leave. But I just think that other countries will look to see what happens to Britain. But if we're really saying, as you kind of hinted in your remarks, Olly, that, you said, admittedly, 62% think that the EU is out of touch with their voters. What do you mean, admittedly? They either are or they're not.
Well, I suppose I'm saying, looking generally at the results, it seems that people are still having positive things to say about them.
Well, you picked out 3 things, and one of them was negative, so that's a reasonable proportion.
I think it's a fair reading of the Pew's research, but you can check out their website for the full breakdown.
I think there's real ambivalence in the attitude towards the EU. I think it's a bit like your family, you can criticise them, but other people can't. And there's that sense of rallying behind the EU now that it's under siege. And I think this is a critical point for the EU. You take the example of Italy, for example, which until the beginning of the year was being ruled by Matteo Salvini in coalition with the anti-establishment five-star movement. And then he overplayed his hand this summer, called an election because he thought he could get a majority government and, in fact, kind of bombed out. And now the five-star movement has formed a coalition with a sort of centre-left party, which is pushing a much more pro-EU agenda. That coalition is shaky as well. And I think Italy very well exemplifies this point now that the EU needs to persuade the doubters, the skeptics, remain and reform, take the Trojan horse approach, if you like. If you don't like it, fine, but it's going to be so hard for you to get out. Come in and make the reforms, turn the EU into what you want it to be.
Yeah.
Sorry, that is fantasy. David Cameron tried to remain and reform. He tried to get them to reform their systems. They wouldn't do it. And that was the moment when I decided this this institution is incapable of meaningful reform, that was the moment I decided I'd vote leave. Because, I mean, I've been making speeches for the European movement not that long ago. So I'm not an anti-European, but I do not believe that this institution is capable of meaningful reform.
If it's for the survival of the EU, you
I
know,
don't care
there are
about the
Euros,
survival of the EU.
but they do.
If countries want to stay within the EU, that, as John said, that's absolutely
Okay,
fine.
so what about closer to home then? Let's talk about the nationalist parties here. Because, I mean, that is just a bizarre situation we have now, isn't it? Which doesn't weirdly get that much attention in the national press, which is what's happening in Scotland and their position, which is essentially Brexit's going really badly. Brexit is against the wills of the people of Scotland because they voted Remain. So our policy, apart from the one Scot we have on our panel,
I'm a quarter.
but we want those people to leave the United Kingdom. Like the people who are so ardently Remain because they see the mess that's happening will want to leave the United Kingdom, which, as you were saying, when you've got the same currency and everything else, it's got to be harder.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I mean, the idea of Scottish independence, a tiny bit of ambivalence in that, which has actually grown since the Brexit vote, because I think it's absolutely reasonable for a country to want to be independent of a larger partner if that's what the majority want. At the same time, the SNP constantly lies about how difficult it will be. Also, Scotland does share a currency with England and Wales and Northern Ireland, and that's incredibly difficult to get out of. And the fact is, if they want to leave Britain to join the EU and therefore take on the euro, then essentially it just flags up that the SNP is just an Anglophobic project. And I know that most people don't like to admit that or talk about that because everybody down here seems to love Nicola Sturgeon for some reason. You know, it's like she's just kind of, you know, the Scottish Nigel Farage.
Someone in the audience clearly does love Nicola Sturgeon. She's charismatic, isn't she? And
so is Nigel Farage, but you all hate him.
She doesn't read. She doesn't read as extreme as Nigel Farage to most centrist people. She reads as someone who has the ability to bring people behind her that English politicians don't.
That's because you live down here and you just don't understand kind of like Scottish. The other thing I've realised about Brexit, etc., it's taught me that politics is exceptionally local. It's like, and these days I try not to comment on Trump because ultimately I don't understand what goes on through an American voter's mind. Oh, he is. I mean, he is nuts, but I don't know, you know, why they voted for him, and I can't really unpick the details. And it's also, you know, whenever I'm talking to kind of Remain voters, they have completely got the wrong idea of why I voted Leave. And sometimes I think I must have the wrong idea of why they want to remain.
Well, maybe they don't want to at all. I mean, Kari, what you were talking about earlier about the ambivalence towards Europe, that's the feeling that I miss. Like, never mind the way I voted in 2016, I now miss the time where it just was obviously not important.
Yeah, I mean, when David Cameron called the EU referendum in 2016, and at that point, there wasn't actually that much. I think there were polls showing that most British voters, they counted membership of the EU as their sort of priority in politics. It was less than 20%, possibly even about 10%. Now it's like, you know, it's the central issue. It's all we talk about. And I suppose there's the good thing that it has politicized Britain even more. You know, everyone's now got an opinion about politics. It seems to be all we talk about. I say it, a podcast like politics thing. But, you know, it turned it into an issue.
Finally on this, Iain, do you think if we Brexit, do you think other European countries will follow us eventually or not?
I think they will just look and see what happens to us. If our economy goes well, if it looks like a success, obviously other countries may well do it. But of course, they would have a referendum, presumably. I can't imagine any government just taking the decision without consulting the people to do something like that. But can I just follow up on something to do with the SNP? What I've discovered is there is one brilliant way to skewer an SNP politician, and that is to say...
Useful life hack, everybody.
Yeah. If you were offered a no-deal exit from the United Kingdom, you'd grab my hand off, wouldn't you? And they just sort of look at you and gulp like a goldfish, because of course they would. And so the inconsistency that you've already pointed out, plus this one, I mean, it just rendered... And I'm like you, I kind of understand Scottish independence. I mean, I am a quarter Scottish, you can tell it from the spelling of my name. If I lived in Scotland, I think I would be superficially attracted to the SNP. And I think if you believe in Brexit, you kind of have to allow the SNP to put their case forward, because it is a reasonable case until you look at the detail. Now, people will say, well, you look at Brexit looks reasonable until you look at the detail, but I'll ignore that one.
Well, if you're someone who's a fan of detail, you'll be thrilled to know we're going to be talking about the euro next after this. Okay, John, your turn. What's the story you're bringing us this week?
Did Mario Draghi really save the euro?
Point.
The head of the European Central Bank has pledged to ensure the euro's future. Mario Draghi signalled that the ECB will take on the financial markets over high Spanish and Italian borrowing costs. Draghi called the single European currency irreversible, adding the Eurozone has the power to defeat market speculation.
Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough.
The comments are Draghi's boldest to date. Economists speculated that they're the prelude to the ECB finding a way to buy the bonds of the Eurozone governments that are most under pressure, or supporting them in some other way that ECB rules allow.
A clip from Euronews dating back to 2012, although it sounded weirdly like Pathé News from the 50s to me. But, John, we wouldn't allow you normally to play in such an old clip on The Week Unwrapped, but what's its relevance to what's happening now?
Well, what matters now is that Mario Draghi is the head of the European Central Bank. Now, he's stepping down at the end of this year, and he's been replaced by Christine Lagarde, who isn't a central banker, but she did used to be the head of the international...
Shouldn't we have had some booing and hissing from the audience at that point?
Yeah. The International Monetary Fund. She's a French politician, basically. So that clip is from 2012, which was during the Greek crisis, which I assume you all remember because it was in our headlines for months and months and months and months. And this was the point where Mario Draghi basically talked to kind of the markets directly and said, "Do you feel lucky, punk?" So
in those words, exactly.
In those words, that was the translation. But and what happened was that basically speculators, as in normal investors, had been betting that the Eurozone would break up, and then Mario Draghi effectively said, "I will buy as many bonds as it takes to stop you guys and make you lose money." And over his time in power, he basically managed to convince the Germans that they were going to allow him to do that. So the interesting thing now is that the European Central Bank has basically managed to get to the stage where it can prevent government debt in any Eurozone country from getting to the interest rate level where that country might go bankrupt. That in turn means that it is essentially impossible for a country like Greece to get kicked out of the Eurozone by accident rather than by choice. And so what he's now done is he's paved the way for Christine Lagarde, who is a politician, to then try and advance further with the political integration. Because in effect, by the back door, he's created monetary integration. So the problem with the euro is that if Germany uses the same currency as Greece, then Germans need to be more like Greeks, and Greeks need to be more like Germans. And you see, this is the tricky bit now.
But this has always been the problem with the euro. You could have said almost everything you've just said in 1991.
Yeah.
So what if Christine Lagarde's the figurehead just because she used to be a politician? I mean, she is an economist too. I mean, it's not like, they've appointed Kermit the Frog, is it?
Aye. The relevance now, though, is that you've replaced a very technocratic guy, so Mario Draghi. So he's set up all the toolbox. And now she's coming in to kind of push the political integration side, because this is the difficult bit. Basically, the Eurozone can't survive unless the end goal is a United States of Europe. And that's not, I know I've admitted I'm a leaver, but that is not me trying to put out propaganda or scaremongering. The problem is if you share a currency, you have to be much more politically unified than the Eurozone currently is.
I think the EU would admit that, though, wouldn't they, Ian?
No, they wouldn't, because the euro has always been a political thing rather than an economic thing. And if they'd been approaching it from a conventional point of view, they would have united the countries first and then had the single currency. But they've done it arse about face. And that's why I think a lot of economists have always thought that in the end it won't survive. Now it survived a lot longer than many people thought back in 2012.
Yeah.
I mean, it's extraordinary that it has survived. I read an anecdote which just, I think, illustrates what a difficult task this central bank faces. A few years ago, a senior analyst at JP Morgan, just as a random sampling, looked at economic data on the 13 countries of the world that begin with the letter M, and found that actually they were better suited to a currency union than the members of the Eurozone. So this just gives you a sense of what a difficult task.
And can you name those 13 countries?
I thought there'd be more. I can only name about 3, but I did think there'd be more.
Malta, Mongolia,
Mauritania,
Morocco,
Mali,
Monaco. Well,
we didn't play your cards right. Anyone got anything bigger than Mozambique? Mexico, yes, Mexico is the obvious one. I mean, referring back to our previous conversation when you were talking about, I guess, populist politicians and fears within the EU that what might be seen as an extreme left or an extreme right party comes to power in one of these countries, what strain would that put the euro under then? You know, if they're not all saying, never mind if they actually want to leave the EU, but if they just have a completely different social agenda, what would that do to the euro?
John?
I think that's an interesting question, but I think, and Kari and I were discussing this before, the thing is all of the populist parties have now backed away from the idea of leaving the euro. Like Salvini's a very good example. He never wanted to leave the euro. He'll talk down the EU, but his argument was that the euro should be more Italian.
Same with Wilders, who we heard at the beginning of that clip. You know, up until the beginning of this year, his party were all like, we want out. We just want out of the Eurozone. Whereas now they've rowed back and said, actually, we want a referendum on membership of the EU and of the Eurozone. So they are pulling back a bit.
It's because everyone saw what happened in Greece. So we got to the point where Greece underwent a depression. So the Greek GDP shrunk by 25%, which is, I mean, unthinkable. I mean, that is kind of like 1930s USA sort of stuff. And that was a direct result of being in the Eurozone and using the euro. But the problem is that whenever people were asked, do you want to carry on with fiscal austerity, they voted against it. But then they were asked in a referendum, do you want to leave the euro? And they said no, because the problem is once you're in the euro, you know that the money in your bank account, if you are one of the weaker countries, is going to collapse. I mean, it'll be worth half of what it's worth the next day after you leave the euro. And I mean, this is why I tend to think the only way the euro will break up now is if the Germans vote to leave, because they get fed up with being told, oh, you need to spend more, you need to be, more fiscally profligate. They can't handle that, basically.
And they are very fed up. I mean, there have been a series of court cases in Germany of being brought by plaintiffs, by groups of people who are just saying the Eurozone has overstepped the mark, that they've gone beyond their remit of what's permitted under these rules. And all of these cases have been overturned so far, but it just shows the strength, the sense of anger that within Germany that they feel they're being made to carry the weaker members.
We heard Draghi say there in that clip that he would do whatever it takes to save the euro. That's back in 2012. What do you think whatever it takes would look like now?
Well, the euro is now saved. Before he stepped down, what he did was he basically said, I'm going to print as much money as I want. And he's installed all these. I suppose what you have to remember is that, see, whenever Mario Draghi took over at the ECB, it was a very youthful central bank, and it didn't have many of the policies, like, for example, the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve in the US would have. Because in Britain, the Bank of England can basically print as much money as it wants and buy as many bonds as it wants, and nobody's going to object. The issue in Europe was simply that the Germans didn't want anyone printing money because essentially they have a folk memory of the Weimar Republic. That's what it boils down to. Basically, Draghi essentially bullied the Germans out of that, partly because he could also wield the idea of Greece collapsing out of the Eurozone as a kind of, a weapon, basically. So what he's done is he's overrode all those objections, and now the ECB essentially has a free rein to prop up any country that it likes within the Eurozone. And that's why I don't think that the euro will crack unless some country actually votes to leave and explicitly votes to ditch the euro, not just the EU.
Well, I think it's fair to say that is a story that could have repercussions for all of us, so you have fulfilled the brief, John.
Thank you.
Finally, it is Iain Dale time after this. And so finally this week, it's Ian. What Brexit story do you think deserves our attention?
I've got a really bad Daily Mail headline here. Can we all just accept that whatever mandate you think there might be for a no-deal Brexit, there's certainly no mandate to remain? The majority of British people voted to leave the European Union, and 3.5 years later, because of the intransigence of people like you in the European Union, it hasn't come to pass.
You're very challenging, and I respect
Well, I am
that.
challenging, partly because you haven't actually read the letter from Boris Johnson. I think if you read the letter, you might have a different understanding of it.
I saw his speech. But anyway, so I'm afraid that we have a different idea of democracy. That
clearly.
To go back to 3.5 years to this so-called referendum. I mean, it was a
so-called
very
referendum.
open-ended.
Oh, seriously? You call it a so-called referendum? But you'd like to have another one, would you?
Yeah, no, yes, and because I...
You've brought a clip of yourself, Ian.
Well, it wasn't just me. It was Heidi Hautala, who is a Finnish MEP. She's Vice President of the European Parliament. And she was one of 3 parliamentary guests that I had on my show on Wednesday, the afternoon that the letter was released. And all 3 of these guests, there was a Liberal Democrat MP, Christine Jardine, Labour MP, Jim Fitzpatrick, none of them, despite being told by my producer what the discussion would be about, none of them had thought to read the letter from Boris Johnson. So, and at the end of it, I just thought, well, how dare these people come on the radio and display that level of ignorance about what they're supposed to be talking about? So, yeah, I was, should we say in her words, quite challenging in that. But
Sassy, I'd go as far to say.
Well, maybe. The attitude there is actually a good illustration of why people voted to leave. And I had so many people on Twitter and emailing saying, well, actually, I voted to remain, but that kind of attitude makes me think maybe I shouldn't have. Now, that feeds into what I think is really sort of the uncovered story. And this is when people make out that if we stayed in the EU, we would just stay in the status quo, that nothing would change, to coin a famous phrase. Well, of course, we all know that's very different, and it wouldn't be like that. Our bargaining position within the EU would be shot to pieces completely. We wouldn't be one of the top 3. I suspect we would be relegated below Italy and Spain in the pecking order. I think that we know now that both Angela Merkel and Macron and Juncker, they all want a European army, which we were told in the referendum was not even a possibility. You can say, well, of course, if Britain stayed in, we could veto it, fair enough. But there is an attitude of mind here which wants further integration in virtually every aspect of political life. We were talking about the euro earlier. I personally, if there was a second referendum and we voted to remain in the EU, I think it is inevitable that we would end up in the euro. In fact, I would probably advocate it, which I know will shock everyone in this room.
Yeah, okay.
But I think it would be a natural progression, because if we stayed in, we can't be this sort of half in, half out Britain that we've been for the last 30 or 40 years.
But that's what the Conservatives were saying for a long time they did want.
What?
They wanted us to sort of remain and reform, be a harder
Yeah, well, I think it's been proved that hasn't worked. So either you come out completely, or if you stay in, you integrate completely.
Okay, there's a lot to unpick there, but let's just, Kari, just deal with the business about Britain not having the negotiating power it used to have if we actually end up remaining. Just on the basis of the size of our economy and our population and our trade. That can't be right, can it?
We would look meeker and weaker in the eyes of the world to some extent. That's inevitable. But we would still have our strong, our relatively strong economy. The EU would still be very dependent on our exports, and there's still very strong trade links. So I think we would still have a voice, definitely.
And how much of that voice would be Brexit Party MEPs? That's the other thing, I suppose, isn't it, to think about? I guess if we remain, the Brexit Party strengthens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a major issue. Whatever else has happened, Brexit has also reshaped domestic politics quite strongly. And so now the Liberal Democrats, for example, would be the party of not only remain, but join the euro, which basically they always were.
To be fair, they deny that.
So politicians deny lots of things all the time.
I was just trying to be fair to the Liberal Democrats, which I sometimes like to be.
That's very decent of you.
I know.
The Tories and Labour obviously have been transformed by the process. And as you say, the thing is, we would have this, Leavers are going to feel cheated. And they will almost certainly vote
Someone's
for.
always going to feel cheated. Whatever the outcome of this, people are going to feel cheated because politicians have lied from word go.
Yeah, but
Well, that's just not true.
52,
You see,
48.
this is
so
the
much
narrative that we were all
But there
lied
was so
to
much
is
misinformation during the campaigns
On
from both
both
sides.
yeah.
I agree, from both
I
sides.
don't think people went into that on both sides deliberately deciding we are going to lie to the British people.
I don't think politicians...
It was a referendum campain,
So
and in any
the NHS bus claim was just shouted out by the
Yeah.
audience
Oh,
there.
well,
We
if
should
I-
deal with
Do
that.
we really want to go there?
Well,
What about, do you remember anyone in 2016 talking about the Irish border question, how we were going to deal with that?
no, because the EU weaponised it about 6 months later when it was to their advantage to do so.
It was
no.
there. It was
All right,
always
let me
under
tell you why
threat.
that was the case. You don't want me to tell you why it's the case. Okay, interesting level of debate then. I'm going to anyway. In September 2017...
That was pretty good technique, actually.
In September 2017, Leo Varadkar made a really impressive speech in Belfast where he said that Britain and the Republic of Ireland should come to a separate agreement on customs outside the orbit of the EU. What happened then was that Brussels was horrified by this and sat on him. And that was when we all heard about the whole issue of the Irish border. Because you're right, it wasn't discussed a lot before then.
But it was always going to be an issue. There would always have to be
Well,
an
if it was
answer
going
to
to
it.
be a
disappear.
huge issue, why wasn't it brought up by
Well, it probably
Remainers?
was in
Exactly.
Ireland.
Why
wasn't
wasn't
it
it
really
brought
wasn't.
up?
It was not brought up by Remainers during the referendum campaign, was it?
We were told.
Was it?
I didn't hear it get discussed at all. No, absolutely, I agree with that.
So therefore, it's become a big thing. And bear in mind that the European Union is mentioned, I think, 3 times in the Good Friday Agreement, not in relation to borders at all. So there is a reason why people have made this an
Let's
issue,
weigh
and
up
we
the
all
two
know what it
scenarios.
is.
Let's weigh up the two scenarios. So the amount of hostility from Remainers and I guess centrists if we Brexit with a hard Brexit versus the anger of Brexiteers if we don't Brexit at all. Because obviously there are stages in between which people would probably learn to get along with. But in those two extremities, what would be less toxic for our national
What would
conversation?
be less toxic would be if we had left with Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, or we'd left in some sort of Norway-style thing. Because, I mean, look, I did not vote to leave because I was worried about free movement of people. Didn't play any part in my decision
But let's be
whatsoever.
honest, most people probably did.
No, I think there were a lot of people that felt like that sort of sovereignty and other issues trumped immigration. But where I think we're heading now is to a really dangerous place, because whatever you think about deal or no deal, if we leave with no deal, there will be short-term economic consequences for that. I have no doubt about that. But if we don't leave, either on October the 31st or indeed at all, think of the democratic consequences of that. There were 3 million people that voted in that referendum for the first time, and most of them voted leave. Now, they're going to think, why would I bother to take part in the democratic process ever again?
But so you're outlining the scenarios, but you're not answering which is worse. You're sort of implying that you think it would be worse to stay in.
Well, I think that was quite clear.
I think there's going to be damage either way. There are going to be people who are disenfranchised. You know, young people, if they're shunted out of the EU against their will, as the majority of young people do want to stay in, they're going to be disenfranchised. Why should they feel like they should ever vote again? You know, there was actually quite a good turnout among young people in the 2016 referendum. But, you know, if they kind of feel like, well, that was all overridden, so what was the point? Why should they engage
the
again?
The logic of that is we should overturn general election results when young people feel that they were disenfranchised. I mean, a lot of Corbynistas
But if you
obviously
feel
thought
your whole future's been wiped
Exactly,
out,
you get a
know,
chance
it's not
every-
you get every
Please.
4 years. It's not.
How would somebody's future be wiped out? You're talking as if they wouldn't be allowed to travel to the EU.
Well, it's
or-
gonna be
or to even
harder.
work there.
I think what we're missing here is that everyone sat down. I mean, basically, the rules of democracy are we all abide by a social contract whereby somebody turned around and said, okay, we're going to ask you your opinion on this. We're going to go with the majority vote. So they set the rules beforehand, you know, and you can quibble about the technicalities, but everyone knew it was advisory, but everyone also said at the time, we will abide by your vote. And we were told it was a once-in-a-lifetime thing. And
we were also told it was
we
going to be
will
the easiest
implement what you
negotiation of all
decide.
time.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, sorry, that's entirely different. That is usual, typical electioneering bull. Can't remember if we're allowed to swear on this podcast or not. So, do you know what I mean? The politicians lie all the time. So the fact
All right,
that
so
they
that makes it
exaggerate.
okay.
No, of course it doesn't
No.
make it okay, but
But
the
what-
exaggerating is part of the electoral process.
That's not exaggerating. I mean, Vote Leave were found guilty of electoral fraud.
Oh, come on. No, sorry, guys.
And
that's
so
just
were Remain, actually.
Yeah,
If you look at the Stronger In
exactly,
campaign.
the
So
whole-
don't
the whole
try and tar
poll
one
was a
side with
joke.
that brush.
No, look,
And almost 3.5 years later, we're still no closer to reaching a conclusion.
No, because what we've
something's
lost
gonna
is what
happen,
John's
but-
just described. We've lost the democratic tradition of losers' consent.
yes.
People who lose a debate or lose an election, they have to abide by the result.
So if that's right, and the least toxic version of this would have been to capitalise on the feeling across the House of Commons and across the country 2.5-3 years ago that Leave had won and that basically Theresa May's deal should have been voted for. The fact it wasn't, whose fault is that? It's the ARG, isn't it? It's Boris Johnson's mate.
And Labour MPs that didn't vote for it, some of whom are now saying they wish they had, and they would vote for a Boris Johnson deal. We can throw around blame all we like. That ship has sailed now. That deal, I mean, it might be revived with some tweaks, but that deal is essentially
I like that
dead.
caveat for people listening in 3 days' time.
Yeah, right.
In fact, we could be looking at exactly the same deal. I think we better leave it there, but just before we do, I'm curious, since we have a live audience, just by a show of hands, how many people in this room, I'll do it as a percentage, I'm really crap at maths, but I'll try. How many people in this room think we are actually going to leave the European Union at some point? Slightly over half, I would say. Would you think that's fair?
at least about 8. Yeah.
Let's call it, what's the other question?
Well, no, just put people's hands up if they don't.
All right. Who thinks we're going to remain and never leave the EU? Yeah, about 40%. I think that's about right. I think my maths was fine. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you. Clap, clap. And that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Kari Wilkin, John Stepek and Iain Dale. Our entire back catalogue remains available online and for €0 streaming as well. You can just search The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. Thanks to Podcast Live for hosting us. The producer, Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, where we won't talk about Brexit, I promise. Bye-bye!